The night I found Celestine, I was parked outside a gas station, eating cold French fries and seriously considering whether God had forgotten my address. That sounds dramatic. But when you have just buried your father, lost your job at the same nonprofit you gave 8 years of your life to, and discovered that your landlord is selling the building you live in, all within the span of 6 weeks, dramatic stops feeling like an exaggeration and starts feeling like an understatement. My name is Joram Whitfield. I'm 38 years old. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and until that November night I would have told you I was a man of faith. I went to church, I tithed, I led the men's accountability group at Shepherd's Gate Fellowship every other Wednesday. I prayed before meals and before bed and occasionally in traffic when the anxiety climbed up into my chest and sat there like a stone. But that night, sitting in my car with cold fries and a grief I had not yet fully let myself feel, I was not sure I believed in anything. I was about to pull out of the gas station when my headlights swept across the side of the building. She was there, a young woman, sitting on the ground against the brick wall with a backpack between her knees and a sleeping bag rolled under her arm that she clutched like something precious. She was wearing a thin jacket entirely wrong for a November night in North Carolina. Her head was down, her hair loose around her face. I put the car in reverse. Then I stopped. I sat there for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Something in my chest, not a feeling exactly, more like a pressure, the way a hand feels when it presses gently but firmly on your shoulder, would not let me finish the motion. I put the car back in park. I still don't fully understand what happened in those few seconds. I only know that something turned me, and everything that came after came from that turning. You need to know who I was before those 6 weeks, because the person who sat in that gas station parking lot was not someone I recognized entirely. I had grown up in Greensboro, the youngest of 4 children, raised by a father named Cornelius Whitfield, who was the most quietly devout man I have ever known. My father did not preach. He was not a pastor or a deacon or a ministry leader of any kind. He drove a delivery truck for 31 years, and he read his Bible every morning at the kitchen table before the rest of the house was awake. He gave generously from what was never very much. He prayed with a specificity that always astonished me, not vague requests but real conversations with a God he appeared to know personally and trust completely. When I was 15 and the neighborhood was difficult, and the pull toward the wrong crowd was real and strong, it was my father who sat with me on the back porch on a summer evening and said, "Joram, a man who stands for nothing will walk into everything. Decide now what you stand for." I decided that night. It held. He died of a stroke in October, 71 years old, 3 days in the hospital and then gone, with very little warning and no chance for the long goodbye I had assumed I would someday have. The grief of it ambushed me in ways I had not predicted. I had thought I was prepared. I had thought faith was an armor against the worst of loss. What I found instead was that grief does not respect your theology. It arrives with the same force regardless of what you believe. The difference faith makes, I was slowly learning, is not in the arriving of the storm, but in whether you have anything solid under your feet when it does. At the time, I was not sure I did. Then the nonprofit lost its largest donor and eliminated my position, along with 6 others, 2 weeks after the funeral. Then the landlord's letter came, and on a Tuesday evening in November, I was sitting in a gas station parking lot with cold food and a faith that felt theoretical. Then the headlights swept the wall. I got out of the car. I want to be honest about this. I got out of the car slowly, cautiously, the way a person moves when they are doing something they have not thought all the way through. I had no plan. I was just moving toward something. She heard my footsteps and her head came up fast, alert, the way someone moves when they have learned to stay watchful. She was young, 19, maybe 20, brown-skinned, with wide, careful eyes and a face that would have been striking under better circumstances. She looked at me with the particular expression of a young woman calculating in real time whether this person approaching her was a danger. I stopped several feet away. I held my hands out slightly at my sides, an instinctive gesture that I hoped communicated, "I mean nothing bad. I don't want to frighten you," I said. "I just saw you, and I couldn't leave." She studied me for a moment. "You a pastor?" No, I'm a recently unemployed nonprofit worker with a bag of cold fries. Are you hungry? Something moved in her expression. The wariness didn't disappear, but something alongside it shifted. Starving, she said. Her name was Celestine Adair. She was 20 years old. She had been in Charlotte for 2 months, having come from Savannah, Georgia after her mother, her only parent, her only family, died of kidney failure in September. Her mother, Winifred Adair, had been ill for 3 years. Celestine had spent the last 2 of those years caring for her, which meant she had quietly stepped back from everything else. Her community college courses, her part-time job, her small social world, until her life had narrowed to the apartment and the hospital, and her mother's bedside. When Winifred died, the apartment and everything in it belonged to Elise. Celestine could not afford a loan. She had no father in the picture, no siblings, no aunts or uncles she was in contact with. A distant cousin in Charlotte had offered a couch for a few weeks. That had ended badly. And so, 2 weeks ago, Celestine had run out of couch and run out of options. She told me all of this over the course of an hour, sitting on the curb outside that gas station while I went inside and bought hot food and 2 coffees, and then sat a respectful distance, away and mostly listened. She was not a crier. She told the story of her mother's death with a dry-eyed steadiness that I recognized, not because she wasn't grieving, but because she had already done a great deal of the crying and had reached the place beyond the tears where you are simply carrying the weight and walking. Your mom was a believer? I asked at some point. Celestine's expression changed, softened in a way that nothing else I'd said had produced. The most faithful woman I have ever known. She used to say God was the only landlord she'd never been late with. I felt something move in my chest. She prayed for you, I said. It wasn't a question. It just came out. Celestine looked at me sideways. All the time, even when she was too sick to say much else. She'd just hold my hand and say God saw me, that He had plans for me, that He wouldn't let me be forgotten. She paused. A long pause. I'd been sitting on that curb for 2 weeks waiting to see if she was right. Here is what I need to tell you, because it changes the rest of the story. I could not take Celestine home. I had a 1-bedroom apartment with 30 days left on its lease. I had a bank account that was performing its own emergency. I had grief sitting on my chest like furniture. I was the last person positioned to be anyone's rescuer. And yet here I was. I thought about calling someone, but it was nearly 11 at night. I thought about a shelter, but I didn't know Charlotte's shelter system well enough to know which ones were safe, which ones had space, which ones didn't require you to be there by 8 in the evening to claim a bed. A deadline Celestine had clearly already missed. I sat there in the cold and I did something I had not done sincerely in several weeks. I prayed. Not a performed prayer, not a structured, articulate prayer. It was more like a distress signal than a conversation. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't have what this situation needs. But something brought me to this parking lot, and I don't believe it was an accident. So if you have a plan here, I genuinely need you to show it to me, because I cannot see it. My phone buzzed. I looked at it, half expecting, I don't know what I expected. But it was a text from a man named Thaddeus Orrin, who led the outreach arm of Shepherd's Gate Fellowship and whom I had not spoken to in almost a month. It said, Joram, been thinking about you. I know things have been hard. Can you call me this week? I stared at it. Then I called him. Right then, at 11 o'clock at night. He picked up in 2 rings. Thaddeus Orrin was 64 years old, built like a man who had once been a linebacker and never entirely forgotten it, with a gray beard and the kind of laugh that came from somewhere deep and genuine. He had spent 30 years doing street and transitional ministry in Charlotte, and he knew the city's needs and networks, the way a surgeon knows anatomy. I told him everything. Celestine sitting 20 feet away from me, wrapped in her thin jacket, drinking gas station coffee. The backpack, the sleeping bag, the story of Winifred Adair dying and leaving a daughter alone in the world. Thaddeus was quiet through most of it. When I finished, there was a pause. You know Emmaus House, he said. I didn't. Women's transitional home on Fairfield, run by a woman from our extended church network, Sophronia Graves. I have been sending people to her for 15 years. Another pause. She called me this afternoon. She has a vacancy. First one in 7 months. The gas station parking lot was very quiet around me. She called you today? I said. This afternoon. Around 3 o'clock. I looked across at Celestine, who was staring at the ground, turning her coffee cup slowly in both hands. Thaddeus, I said. My voice had gone slightly unsteady. I know, he said. I know. His voice was warm, and sure in the way of someone who has seen this enough times to not be entirely surprised by it. Let me call Sophronia. You stay with that young woman. Don't you leave her alone in that parking lot? I won't, I said. And Joram, a pause. Your father is gone, I know. And you've been trying to grieve him and keep yourself together at the same time. And that is a hard thing. But I need you to hear me. God did not bring you to that parking lot by accident tonight. He knew what you were carrying. He sent you anyway. Not because he was indifferent to your pain, but because this is how he works sometimes. He puts the broken to work and heals them in the working. I pressed my fist to my mouth and said nothing for a moment. Call me back in 10 minutes, Thaddeus said, and hung up. I called back in 10 minutes. Thaddeus had a yes from Sophronia Graves. There was a room. It was available immediately. Sophronia was awake. She told Thaddeus she hadn't been able to sleep, which was unusual for her, and had been sitting in her kitchen reading when he called. I walked back over to Celestine and crouched down to her level. I have somewhere for you to go tonight, I said. A safe place. A real room. Run by good people, I paused. If you trust me. She looked at me for a long moment. 20 years old, alone in the world, sitting on pavement in the cold. Every reason in the world not to trust a stranger. My mother told me God would send someone, she said. Quiet and even. I've been waiting 2 weeks. I think you might be the someone. Sophronia. Graves was a small woman in her early 60s who met us at the door of a wide, well-lit house on Fairfield Avenue in a bathrobe and slippers, with reading glasses still on her head and a look on her face that contained no irritation whatsoever at being called out of her kitchen at 11:30 at night. She took one look at Celestine and opened her arms. And Celestine, who had not cried once in the hour I had known her, who had held herself together with the tensile strength of someone long practiced at it, walked into those arms and wept. I stood on the porch. I looked up at the sky. It was clear and cold, and the stars were doing what they always do, which is exist with complete indifference to whether we are looking at them or not. I felt something inside me shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a loosened knot begins to give when the right thread is pulled. My father was gone. That was still true. My job was gone. Also still true. My apartment had 30 days left on it. Also true. None of the circumstances had changed. But I was standing on a porch in Charlotte having been used. Somehow. In spite of everything. And something about that would not allow me to continue feeling entirely forgotten. I went back to Shepherd's Gate Fellowship. Not out of obligation, out of something more honest, the slow realization that I had been trying to carry grief as a solo enterprise, which is not what grief is designed for. Thaddeus put me to work in the outreach team in a new capacity, connecting with displaced men in transitional situations, people who had lost jobs, lost housing, lost the organizing structure of their lives and didn't know how to begin rebuilding. I was, it turned out, specifically qualified for this. Not despite what I had been through, but because of it. I found a new apartment. It took 6 weeks and 2 loans I am still paying back, but it happened. And Celestine Adair was not a passive recipient of what God arranged that November. She was a person who, once she had a floor under her feet again, got to work with a focus that regularly left the rest of us slightly breathless. Within 2 months at Emmaus House she was helping. Sophronia with intake, sitting with new arrivals, talking to them in the quiet and particular way of someone who had herself arrived cold and carrying everything she owned. She had a gift for it, the ability to be fully present with someone in their worst moment without flinching, without performing empathy, without the mild panic that overcomes people who have never sat on a curb. She enrolled in a nursing program at the community college. She told me she wanted to work in palliative care, to be present with people at the end of their lives and with the families they were leaving behind, because she knew what it was to be the person left behind, and she wanted no one to go through that alone if she could help it. She started attending Sunday services at Shepherd's Gate. She came initially, I think, more out of gratitude than conviction. But conviction has a way of building when you are honest with it, and Celestine was constitutionally honest. She sat in those services and engaged with everything, offered to her with the serious, evaluating attention of someone who intends to actually decide what she believes. One Sunday she came and found me before the service started. She sat down next to me in the pew and without preamble said, "I prayed this morning." A real one. "I think the wall has a door in it." I didn't say anything. I just nodded. "My mother used to say God sees us," she said. I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. I think I believe it again. 4 months after that November night, Celestine found something in the bottom of her mother's box of belongings. A cardboard box that Sophronia had been storing in the Emmaus house back office from the first night. It was a small journal, burgundy cover, Winifred Adair's handwriting inside it. Celestine brought it to me on a Saturday. She held it like something that needed careful handling. "You need to read one part," she said. She had already marked it with a folded corner. She handed it to me open. I read, "Celestine doesn't know how frightened I am for her. I don't show it. I can't let her spend what time we have watching me worry. But at night I give it all to God. I tell him, you made her. You know her better than I do. When I am gone, don't let her fall through. Send someone. I don't know who you'll send or how, but I know you will. I know it the way I know my own name. She will be in trouble and she will be alone, and you will send someone who wasn't looking for her. Someone who almost kept going, and you'll turn them around. I believe this. I write it down so I can read it back when I'm afraid. He will send someone. He will turn them around." The date on the entry was 3 weeks before Winifred died. I read it twice. Then I set the journal down on the table between us and pressed both hands, flat on the surface to give myself something solid to hold on to. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Someone who wasn't looking for her. Someone who almost kept going. You'll turn them around. Cold French fries. A gas station. Headlights swinging across a brick wall. A foot on the reverse pedal. And the thing, that hand on shoulder pressure, that would not let me finish the motion. "She prayed this before she died," I said finally. "Yes. She prayed for a stranger. For someone she'd never meet. For a turning she'd never see. Yes." And I almost didn't turn. Celestine looked at me. Her eyes were full, but she was, as always, steady. "But you did," she said. "You did turn. I know things now that I did not know in that parking lot. Not because I have suffered less. I still miss my father, with a physical ache that catches me, sometimes in ordinary moments, washing dishes, driving, hearing an old song. But because the suffering has been given a context I did not have before, I know that God does not only work when we are strong. He works especially when we are emptied, because emptied people are easier to move. I was a man with a grief I hadn't processed, a job I no longer had, and a resignation from faith collecting quietly in my chest. And I was standing in a gas station parking lot at the exact moment I needed to be standing there. I know that the prayers of a dying mother in a Savannah apartment reached Charlotte, North Carolina in November. I do not know the mechanics of this. I only know the evidence. I know that Thaddeus's inability to sleep and his feeling that he should text me after weeks of silence, and Sophronia's vacancy on that specific day. These were not coincidences. I have lived long enough and paid enough attention to know what coincidence feels like. It does not feel like this. And I know this. The miracle Winifred prayed for was not only for Celestine. It was for me. I was the one on empty. I was the one who had started to drift from the faith my father built his whole quiet, magnificent life on. I was the one who needed to be interrupted, rerouted, given something that required me to believe again. Not theoretically, not as a habit, but urgently and personally. God sent me to find a girl on a curb, and found me in the sending. Celestine is in her 2nd year of nursing school. She volunteers at Emmaus house on weekends. She has a small apartment now, her first, and on the window ledge she keeps a plant her mother would have liked and a photograph and a small burgundy journal that she does not read often but never puts away. My father's Bible is on my nightstand. I read it in the mornings now, not out of discipline, out of hunger. Last month, Celestine and I were both at Shepherd's Gate when Thaddeus stood up to give announcements and mentioned that a young man had shown up at the church that week, 22, recently laid off, evicted, family in another state. He had nowhere to go. Thaddeus was asking if anyone had a connection, a lead, a room, anything. Celestine and I looked at each other across the pew. She already had her phone out before I could say a word. That is what a turning produces. It does not end with one life redirected. It multiplies. It sends people out with the specific authority of their own. Stories, not polished testimonies, but real ones. With parking lots and cold fries, and cold nights in thin jackets and walls with doors in them. Winifred Adair prayed from her sickbed for a stranger to turn around. The stranger turned, and the turning is still going. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. Jeremiah 1:5. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Romans 8:28.